All right, everyone, welcome to part two. This is Nathan Lindorf with The Rational Independent, and this is part two of Patrick Bet-David interviewing Jeffrey Toobin, CNN legal analyst and sometimes miscreant, discussing a broad array of topics. At the moment, I believe we're discussing election chances for 2024, some of the ins and outs of those political considerations. Let's get back into it.
And if I'm elected president, reelected, abortion is going to remain legal in the states where it's illegal, where it's still legal. That may be more important than anything else, because that is a substantive difference that people can see have implications in their real lives, more than the fact that he's old.
And you may have a point there if the economy stays intact. If there's no Russia doesn't get uglier than it already is today, if China does anything else with Taiwan, if there's not that cyber attack that they're talking about could be coming in the next 12 months, if there's a lot of ifs, but if none of that happens and it goes intact and he drives that's going to be a big issue. What do you think is going to be the second and third issue that Democrats want to hear?
Well, I think look, every president.
So one of the things that I like about Patrick Bet-David is that when he has these interviews, he will push and he will ask for people to defend their positions. But generally his interview style is to open up with a fairly broad question, with a question that is, that's within their wheelhouse. And that is, it's not a gotcha question. It's a wide open question. With Neil deGrasse Tyson, his opening question for that segment was, what do you think are our lessons learned? What do we know now that we didn't know then? With Jeffrey Toobin, being that he is a legal and political analyst for CNN, he's asking him what the Democratic Party, what their considerations are for choosing their candidate for 2024. Right in his wheelhouse. After the primary consideration, now he's saying, help me out. What do you think number 2 and number 3 are? Again, giving his guest a chance to expand. To my mind, that identifies someone who's acting in good faith. That is someone who is trying to help the other party elucidate their position as clearly as they can, help them make their case. And he'll push back on his own to try and make his case. But in good faith, trying to, by having one side articulate their position and him articulate his position, even if they don't agree, it helps to define with clarity for the audience both sides of the position. And that helps the audience make their own decisions about where they stand in regards to these issues. 2 thumbs up so far.
Presidential election at some level is about the state of the economy. That's certainly going to be central, and also peace in the world.
It's the economy, stupid.
Yeah, it's the economy, stupid. I think at the moment, Biden has a good story to tell. Also, the fact that he passed that big infrastructure bill, which the projects are going to start to come online, where people are actually going to see the bridges, the highways, the mass transit start to be fixed.
Mm-hmm.
All of that, I think, is going to be a big part of his pitch.
This is a personal bugaboo of mine, so a little bit less of the direct analysis. The Democrats like to claim infrastructure spending because that polls well. They did focus groups and testing and on messaging, and they found that when you call government spending infrastructure, then people go, oh, I like infrastructure. That sounds like a government thing to do. And it captures kind of that low information voter, gives them a warm, fuzzy feeling. It's not an accurate descriptor of what we're actually talking about. Again, kind of a personal bugaboo of mine. That's all I'm going to say. We're going to move ahead, but I could go down a rabbit hole on that.
In addition to abortion, but as you point out, if the economy goes south, that becomes an enormous problem for him. But
I do think it's interesting that he's positioning it as if the economy goes south. Even that Patrick Bet-David says, if the economy doesn't remain stable. They're arguing and operating from a position that things are fairly okay right now. But economically, That is not the case. Inflation is a tax on those who are poorest. Inflation is a tax, and inflation has been ravaging small households, fixed income households, people who have meager means, people living paycheck by paycheck. It is like trying to walk through quicksand. My wife and I relocated from Arizona to Colorado a year ago, a little over a year ago, at the time when gas prices were jumping and jumping and jumping. And it just so happened that we had to fill up our moving truck multiple times. You know, it's not very fuel efficient. Right, basically at the peak of gas prices last year, we were paying $5.50 a gallon to fill a moving truck. And I just remember looking at her and going, man, we timed this really badly. And thankfully we had sufficient cash flow. We were able to manage that. We're both fairly productive, but it's pretty easy for me to empathize and say, if I'm less well off, if I don't have as much flexible cash and I need to relocate, maybe for a job opportunity, maybe to take care of a relative, maybe for school or whatever, having gas prices double in less than a year is crushing to people for whom gas is a major part of their budget. And I think either PBD is just giving him the benefit of the doubt, or maybe he himself has a blind spot here because he's fairly well off himself. But when gas is 0.5% of your monthly income, or your expenditures on gas, then you don't really care how much gas fluctuates. But when gas to commute, to get back and forth to your work, when that kind of wear and tear, when that's 10% of your monthly income, now if it doubles, you're in huge trouble. Not to mention the fact that we're in one of the worst used car market, new car markets. By worst, I mean most expensive ever. If you are living paycheck to paycheck and you have an older vehicle and you're driving it to and from a job that you need, maybe you're driving further than you need to or want to, so your gas is higher than you want, and you wreck that car or it breaks down and you have to replace that, that can be ruinously expensive for someone who is just trying to get by in this kind of inflationary economy. I don't blame just Joe Biden on the inflation. If I go down that rabbit hole, we can talk about it, but President Trump did plenty of things that were inflationary. If there's one thing I disagree with him on, it's his spending policy. He basically had no restraint on the spending and just shoveled money out the front door. And you got to pay the piper for that eventually. And here we are paying it. And somehow in this conversation between these two people, they're both basically saying, it's fine now, but if it gets worse, then it'll be a problem. No, there's a reason Rich Men North of Richmond resonated, because it's bad right now, if you're willing to look and see it.
At the moment, it hasn't yet.
And Pat's absolutely right about the if. There's always an if.
Of course, yeah.
One could argue, if COVID didn't exist, Donald Trump would currently be the president of the United States right now.
Absolutely. You could.
I think that's correct, but let's give it just a bit of refinement. And I forget the name of this other gentleman on PBD. He starts talking to Jeff Toobin more directly. So we're going to have to, hopefully we'll catch his name, but I think we need to add a little refinement to that. He said, if COVID didn't exist, Trump will be president because it's the economy, stupid. That's the analysis that they're discussing. Politically, that's sound in the sense that when the economy tanks, that's very bad for the incumbent. And the economy tanked in 2020, right before the election. However, I would argue that the economy didn't tank from COVID. It tanked from government interference in the marketplace as it relates to COVID. In other words, the shutdowns, the mandates, the lockdowns, they basically crippled the economy on purpose as a matter of government policy right before the election. That's what happened. If you look at the economy in January and February of 2020, if that had continued on its trajectory, President Trump, hands down, he is the president today. There's no chance the Democrats have of winning. But if you look at the economic markers of what happened, a lot of which can be tied to government interference in the marketplace, that creates economic damage, that creates economic uncertainty, and that creates people more willing to try the other guy.
Agree with that.
Well, I mean, certainly COVID played a big part in Biden's victory. You know, this sort of what if something else had happened. It's very hard to know, but you're certainly right that COVID was a big issue, and you know, this also goes for DeSantis too. That
He would be not known whatsoever.
Well,
without COVID.
and you know, I don't know. At the moment, it doesn't look like he's going to beat Trump. But if he beats Trump and becomes the nominee, the way he handled COVID will be a big part of the presidential campaign. Although presidential elections tend to be more forward-looking than backward-looking.
And Jeffrey, do you think that DeSantis even has a chance, considering that the indictment just came out and Trump went up? He went up in the polls.
I absolutely think DeSantis has a chance.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Oh,
Okay.
Absolutely. Has a chance, certainly. You know, I mean, being indicted is a really bad thing.
Yeah, for sure.
And, you know, his presence in the courtroom in New York and now here in Florida is not going to be optional. It's
has
not
to
like
go.
the civil case, you know, which he lost
York.
in New York,
Yeah.
where
So what they're talking about is that Trump's been indicted several times and now indicted in a criminal trial, which means that he has to go to court. Now, you might know whether or not you're paying perhaps this level of attention. You may know that or not, but the preliminary dates scheduled for the Georgia indictment and I think the New York indictment, although I'm not sure, get them confused, is the day before, for the trial to start, the day before the Super Tuesday of the Republican primary. That's not coincidental. I mean, I'm not a Republican operative, but I can look at this and say, oh, Trump's a threat politically, so let's tie him up in some criminal indictments, so he has to be there. And let's give him the presence, let's give him the media appearance of a criminal defending himself effectively in trial, right as we're going through the election, the primary. And then, you know, I think we have a few more indictments stacked up. If he ends up navigating that and still being the nominee and still being politically relevant, well, you know, I bet we could probably tie him up with some court stuff. Oh, I don't know, campaigning in the general election as lead up. Like, I don't see a way of looking at this and seeing it as anything but election interference. I think the only argument is it justified election interference? Just because you're a political candidate doesn't mean you're above the law. However, I think every effort should be made from the criminal justice system's perspective to try and impact the electoral process as little as possible. But we are in uncharted territory. I mean, no former president has ever been indicted criminally. This is a first. It's happened multiple times, and it happens to be not just a former president, but a former president who is running for another term and actively campaigning right now. We're in uncharted territory. I don't think anybody knows exactly how this is going to pan out. We'll see.
he didn't go, and he didn't testify. You know, when you're indicted, and you know, as a former federal prosecutor, it is worth, you know, remembering that upwards of 90% of the people who are indicted in federal court wind up either pleading guilty or being convicted. So
I'm going to take his stat just on face value. Over 90% of people who are indicted in the federal court system either take a plea or are convicted. That speaks to one of two things. Looking at it from the outside in, I don't have any specific expertise in this area. As I look at that, that means one of two things. Either A, the federal judiciary is very conservative, and so the indictment process is therefore very cautious, which we could then extrapolate and say, if you're indicted, it's because you've got a pretty solid case. In other words, they pretty much pick sure winners. You know, no one's perfect, but if they get you through to the indictment process in the federal system, you could argue that means you're pretty much toast. You know, they've got you cold. That's possible. What else is possible is the process is the punishment. The simple truth is the federal judiciary is cumbersome and expensive and slow and can grind basically anybody down. It's the biggest bully on the block. Their jurisdiction is the whole of the United States. You have to deal with them no matter where you live. And if they get their hooks in you, they own your life until either you take a plea, they convict you, or maybe after bankrupting you, you are acquitted in federal court. You know, that rare single percentage chance of the time, okay? Now that's a regular defendant. I think he's going to talk about this. Trump being who he is politically makes it a bit of an unusual circumstance. But the truth of the matter is, I think the Georgia indictments came out after this conversation. And in the Georgia indictments, Donald Trump's lawyers were also indicted in federal court. And they're estimating that for his co-conspirators, also known as the lawyers he had on retainer who were advising him during 2020, those lawyers are going to need to spend upwards of $1 million plus $2 million to defend themselves in federal court against one of these sets of indictments. Most people can't do that. Most people, that's going to bankrupt them. Most people will basically take a plea deal just to get out of the process, because the process will grind just about anybody down.
We'll see.
So yeah, it
90%.
90%
People who are
federal court.
indicted?
Yeah.
So ultimately, you're saying there's a 90% chance that he's going to be
Well,
found guilty?
you know, Donald Trump's case is he's such an anomalous defendant that I don't know if you can just treat him like an ordinary defendant. I mean, a lot of these cases are pretty routine. This is obviously not a routine case, but especially compared to the New York case, which I think is not a particularly strong case and not something that most voters would see as disqualifying. The federal case is I think very different. And also just the rules of federal procedure are tougher on defendants than the New York rules are. Now, again, Trump got a good piece of luck with Judge Cannon, who has been sympathetic to him in the past. But you know, it's still, I think, you know, yes, in the initial wave, he he got a certain boost in the polls, or at least the polls didn't change much. If he's sitting in court day after day, and the public has to ask itself, what if he's convicted? How does it work to have a convicted?
And that's the trick. We're in uncharted territory. You can run for president. You can run for president from a jail cell. If you're convicted and you go to prison, in theory, in the eyes of the law, that doesn't bar you from pursuing federal office. Not on the face of it. Now, practically speaking, what does that look like? I mean, it is a twisty-turvy mess. But let's take, for example, the New York indictment, which is a state indictment, not federal. And let's say he's indicted there, he's has his trial, and he's convicted. He now needs to go serve a jail sentence in New York City while he's the sitting president. If he doesn't surrender to that court and stays away from New York, does he get extradited from the White House as the sitting president? Like, it just gets really weird, really messy, really fast. This is a time bomb. No one really knows how it's going to pan out, but it is a weird one.
Felon, the president of the United States. I mean, that I don't think, we in the news media, we spend a lot of time talking about polls, but the polls change, and events change the polls. So the idea, I don't think the world has fully absorbed the magnitude of what it means to be indicted in federal court.
Because it doesn't disqualify him. But don't you think, Jeff, just from seeing that one poll, his real supporters here, his real followers, that's making them more energetic, because they're seeing that one side is getting treated one way, he's getting treated the other way. If you think about it, you know this for a fact, Hillary did this.
So these two side gentlemen, they're common co-stars on the PBD podcast. I think one of them's name is Vinny. Sorry, I don't know their names. Thing one and thing two, I don't know. We'll figure something out. He is less careful with his words. He says things like, you know this for a fact. He's imputing his own perspective on the other person. And rhetorically, that's not very helpful for a couple of reasons. It's not very helpful because you're not giving the other person a chance to speak. You're kind of putting words in their mouth. And it can create a bit of antagonism where now the other person kind of feels like they need to fight you off and say, no, I don't know if that's for a fact. And now you're arguing over something that he wants to just take as a given. Now, I think the reason why they have him on the podcast is because he rather well represents the id of the American consciousness in the sense of the layman's outside perspective on, I'm not a trained rhetorical person. I'm not a trained debater. I'm not interested in all the niceties and formalities. I know what I know because it feels right to me. And that's what I'm operating from. This is what we're doing. There's room for that in the conversation because there's a bunch of people in America who think that way and feel that way. But it ends up being similar to how we talked about the difference between laymen and experts in the Neil deGrasse Tyson conversation. Jeffrey Toobin is a lawyer. What that means is that when you're arguing with a lawyer, they don't take anything for granted. They don't assume facts not in evidence. They're trained to question and challenge every little bit. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation, is because what we're about to enter into is a phase of the conversation where Jeffrey Toobin, as a skilled professional communicator, as a trained, educated lawyer, is going to be engaging with the political case of Hillary Clinton with someone who is not a trained debater, not as careful in his speech, and yet feels very passionately about the topic. And I think it leads to some interesting and illuminating back and forth. So let's see where it goes.
The same, if not the exact same type of stuff. Joe Biden has documents, but they're locked by his Corvette. And we just saw it with Hunter just yesterday. They gave him 2 misdemeanors and something else when we all know everything that was on his laptop proved it's 100% provable that him with his father, they were peddling money and they were getting bribes. But let's be honest, Jeff, you don't think it's gonna help him? People seeing, look at what they're doing to him and what they're not doing to the other side.
He just laid out a whole bunch of stuff, but listen to the way that he's speaking and presenting his ideas. It's 100% proven, it's given, it's facts that we know. We all have to agree this is the way it is. This is how his supporters feel. And it's good for him to kind of voice that perspective in this conversation.
You said about 5 things there,
Yeah.
each one of which could be
yeah.
debated. But you are certainly right that his true believers will be energized by that.
I want to give Jeffrey Toobin a little bit of credit. That is when you're dealing with someone who is overly enthusiastic, overly bombastic, overly sure of their position. One of the ways you can keep the conversation civil and keep the conversation going, if you object to much of what they just said, is to say, okay, well, a lot of that is debatable, but then identify a point of agreement where Jeffrey Toobin says, you know what? The people who are true, loyal fans of Trump, ride or die Trump fans, whether or not it's right that we have that in our politics, but we do, believe that he's being railroaded by the system. Everyone can see that. He's not admitting that that's factually true, that Trump is being railroaded by the system. He's agreeing that Trump's fans feel that way. And that seems like a fine gradation, but when you're talking to lawyers, they live in a world of fine gradations.
It's not enough to win a presidential election. His true believers are maybe 30% of the country. That's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people.
But that's not enough to win to win the presidency. And what remains to be seen is how the rest of the public proceeds.
You're absolutely right that it's enough to win a primary potentially, but it's not enough to pivot to the general election. I want to stay on the Trump indictment. As a former attorney, are you still?
I'm still an attorney.
Congratulations. You've seen Trump's former Attorney General, Bill Barr, give a scolding rebuke to what Donald Trump is doing. And he defends him in many ways still.
Right, yeah.
It basically says that all the Russia collusion stuff and the impeachment stuff
Right.
was a sham. But on this particular issue, the FBI search documents, that he's basically coming out and vocalizing, Trump was absolutely in the wrong here. What's your opinion on what Bill Barr is basically saying about Trump?
Well, I think it's significant because I think, we now live in such an incredibly polarized political environment that any time someone on your side says you're wrong, it becomes very significant. The fact that Adam Schiff thinks Donald Trump did something wrong. Who cares, right? I mean, exactly. Yeah. I mean that's to be to be expected. But as you point out,
yes.
Bill Barr was his attorney general, was a Trump defender in many respects, and
the top attorney in the United States.
Yeah, and unlike the New York case, the Florida case is pretty easy to understand. I mean, it's not a super complicated.
Break it down like we're all fifth graders.
Well,
So now we're narrowing in on the Florida case, and we'll talk about that in a second. But this is it's a mixed conversation. Jeffrey Toobin's getting questions from a lot of different angles, different styles of interrogation, different styles of questions. And one thing I want to point out, the gentleman that said you have to agree that this is all the way that this is. His points were basically softened and deflected by Jeffrey Toobin. They agreed on one small item, which is that Donald Trump's followers feel this way. And that's the end of that effect on the conversation, at least for now. The conversation moves on. Did he change anyone's mind? He feels that very firmly. You can see that. Did he make any impact on the other person in the conversation? I would argue very little. If anything, Jeffrey Toobin probably marked him off in his mind as someone who's not being reasonable, someone who is already convinced this, beyond reach, someone who's already a committed believer, which can make it very difficult to carry on in good faith. So now we're shifting the conversation from this gentleman here, who's narrowing the focus down to Bill Barr, who's the former Attorney General appointed by Donald Trump for part of his term, who is critical of Donald Trump's behavior regarding classified documents handling. Now, not to litigate this case, but this is the topic at hand, so we're going to get into it. I think what's interesting is that Jeffrey Toobin says this is the most easy to understand. So we're going to listen to the case as he lays it out, given that this is within his area of expertise. We're going to hold him to a slightly higher standard because he's a lawyer. So let's see how he lays this case out.
It's that, when you are president of the United States, you are allowed to declassify anything you want, and but you have to actually do it. But if you take stuff with you and they ask for it back, you have to give it back. And he seems actively to have known that he had stuff that he wasn't supposed to have. And then in the face of a subpoena, said, I'm not giving it back anyway. That's a crime. That's a crime that other people have been prosecuted just for possessing the documents. Forget not giving them back. And it's not And this is where, you know, the difference from the Hillary Clinton and the Joe Biden situation comes along. They were never asked to give back, and they found the stuff and gave it back voluntarily.
This is one of the things that I wanted to narrow in on. So let's talk a little bit about this. He's making the assertion that Donald Trump had documents he wasn't supposed to have. That Donald Trump had documents that were not declassified. That's arguable, okay? Factually, I wasn't there, so we don't know. But the simple truth is, the president has essentially unlimited power to declassify information. And he can't get in trouble for doing that, even if he doesn't follow proper process. There is a process within the federal government for classification and declassification, okay? And there's plenty of arguments that we can make about, do we classify too many things, blah, blah, blah. Is it a good process, whatever. But essentially, the process exists within the federal government for everyone except the president. He is the exception that proves the rule, okay? As president, if he is giving a press conference and he decides in that moment, without consulting with anyone, to share classified information, public, live, with everybody, Jeffrey Toobin is saying he should be able to be prosecuted for not declassifying it first. That's just not true. I mean, think about it on the face of it. If Donald Trump or any president, okay, is in a negotiation with a foreign power, is prosecuting a war, is operating as the commander-in-chief, and he decides in that moment, based on his judgment, to declassify something that was previously classified, he has the power to do that within himself without following the process that applies to everybody else, because they are not the president. They don't have that power. That is something that the Constitution imbues in the president by virtue of the fact that he was elected. That's why if I'm coming in from the outside and I need access to this classified information, I have to get a security clearance. I have to go through a vetting process. I have to be cleared by the federal authorities that manage this access to classified information. Guess who doesn't have to get a security clearance? The President of the United States. His security clearance is the election. That's effectively where his authority comes from. By being elected to the head of the executive branch, he has access to all of the information contained within the executive branch. That's like saying, I mean, if you follow this same logic, you're basically saying that someone who's subordinate to the president has the right to deny the president access or control of any information within the federal government. That's like the president going to an archivist and saying, I want to look at these papers, and the archivist saying, no, sir, you don't have the clearance. That is unconstitutional and bonkers. Now, as a lawyer, he's welcome to make that legal argument. Personally, I think it's crazy. Doesn't seem to stand up on the face of it. And I just explained my reasoning for that. Now, here's where we get into something that's a bit of an interesting rhetorical tactic. And lawyers are very good at this. But let's see what just happened. The obvious comparison that's been brought up by the co-hosts already is that people view Donald Trump's treatment on this matter of handling classified documents as unfair because those politicians that are relevant to this conversation, his opponent in his first election and his opponent most likely in this election, Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, those are the comparisons, both on the left, both Democrats. Both could be accused of mishandling classified information when they were not president. Hillary Clinton was never elected president. Joe Biden had a whole bunch of misbehavior prior to being elected president, okay? If you are comparing A to B, Trump to Biden or Clinton, okay? The most important distinction between those two things is who was president and who was not. And he comes up and says, there's a distinct difference between these two cases. But the difference that he draws is that President Trump didn't give the documents back as requested, and Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden did. They're okay because they complied with the bureaucracy. He's bad because he did not comply. It sounds like he's addressing the distinction between the two cases, but he is leaving silent the most salient distinction between the cases.
Hillary, well, no. Hillary destroyed, and hold on.
This is a meaty thing. We're going to save it for part 3. Okay, we're going to break right here. Hopefully this is useful confirmation. Hopefully this is useful confirmation. Can't talk. We're going to leave it right here. We'll pick it up again in part 3. Please drop a comment. Let me know what you think. We cover a fair amount of detail here. I'm interested in if you think this is helpful, if there's other things you'd like me to do, other things to focus on, etc. I appreciate your time. I enjoy doing these. We're going to dive into them and keep going in the next segment. And until then, good luck out there.